Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Jens, and thank you, John, for 3 very nice presentations. I'm going to take just 10 minutes to give you just a few of my own comments about each of these presentations and pieces of research. Now, you should take this time to either listen to me or think about the questions you're going to ask in the Q&A. They're not mutually exclusive, I don't think, but after I'm done speaking, and then after Marty is done speaking, we'll have a Q&A session, and I don't think we have very many shrinking violets in this group, but I always think it's good to remind you to write the question down now so you don't forget it. All right. So to the bank supervisors here. The following statement would not be surprising. I think you'd all agree with it, and it's routine supervision reduces bank risk-taking. Routine supervision reduces bank risk-taking. I think all the supervisors in the crowd would agree with that. We take this as a truth that's handed down. John tests this idea. Now, how does he test this thing? I mean, we've had routine supervision for a long time. It's very difficult to know whether, in fact, it does reduce risk-taking, as we believe. Well, he takes advantage of a natural experiment. He has to go back about 25 years to find that natural experiment. In 1983, because of some political maneuvering, the Federal Home Loan Bank district in the headquarters in the 9th District was moved from Little Rock to Dallas. And, of course, the problem was that a large majority of the examiners choose to quit the FHLB rather than to move to Dallas. And my word is what ensued then, supervisory negligence, let's say, ensued. And we see it in the data, and what John shows is that the frequency of examinations declined. Getting my head around this took a little while until I realized that this was a long time ago in a world very different from the one we now know. This was not just pre-Dodd-Frank, this is pre-Fiducia. Right, supervision and periods of elapsed time between examinations. This is all very loose in different parts of the country for different regulators. So that's the world we're in. So it's this supervisory negligence is a little more believable if we think back to what the world was like back in the early 1980s. They find John finds clean and clear results, uses a difference in difference models, and to the uninitiated in the crowd, what you've heard difference in difference models announced twice here. What is it? Well, it's a simple concept. What John does is he takes a look at the thrifts in the 9th District. He looks at their performance. He compares that performance to thrifts that are not in the 9th District. And he sees that tests whether the comparison between those two groups of performance changed from before the moving from Little Rock to Dallas to after, to see if that move had any effect on the relative performance of the thrifts that were in the 9th District. The model produces very clean results. Supervisory negligence, again, my term, is associated with riskier loans. Okay, so the kinds of loans, the loan portfolio move towards loans that we know have higher default risks, a higher probability of insolvency of the thrift, and when there were failures, the failures were more costly to the taxpayers. So it's very simple, very straightforward, very neat, and I think actually in some ways an important paper. I take 2 things away from it. Number one, indeed, less frequent examination, or we could say that, less frequent examination results in more risk-taking at banks. And indeed, we have this evidence, this kind of set of point estimates and things that show that it really does happen. The second question I have is, why did thrifts increase risk? I mean, bankers don't take risks just for the sake of taking risks. I think bankers take risks because they think they're going to get greater returns. Yet the authors don't test to see whether greater returns happen. And I'm going to repeat this for the second paper. As Jens said, the first 2 papers are similar, although I'll point out, I think, an important difference between the 2. And I would like to see what we have there, because if we don't find some evidence of greater returns in either of the papers, it's going to be more difficult to test for it in the first paper because you only have one point in time, and all sorts of things could be driving returns. But that's what I would hope to find. Jens' paper is very similar, although I'll make the following point. In the first paper, we had an unexpected reduction in supervision, an unexpected reduction, right? There was a move and a bunch of people quit and they didn't count on that. In Yen's paper, we had a planned reduction in supervision, right? We have fewer banks, we have too much overhead, we want to save money, so we're going to shut down some local supervisory offices. That was planned. Okay, so the economists in the crowd are thinking about this, know that expected changes and unexpected changes can result in very different outcomes. And I want to make that point. Oh, the outcomes seem to be similar. Jens takes advantage of a natural experiment. Several dozen office closures by the OCC, the Fed, the FDIC over several decades. And again, a difference in differences model where Jens compares the performance of the affected banks to the performance of banks that did not have their local supervisory office closed, and looks to see whether that relative performance changes before and after the closure of the offices. Now, the key idea here is about information. That's what's going on here. The idea is that when you have your office closed, now you're being supervised by a set of examiners who are further away from you, and we know that subjective information and soft information doesn't travel well. And there's a literature on this, in banking, in fact. We have research that looks at the distance between banks and borrowers, and as the distance between banks and borrowers increases, loan defaults increase. In fact, we have other research that says the longer the distance, the further the distance between a bank and its borrower, the more likely the bank is to use credit scoring underwriting techniques because soft information is not useful at long distances. We also have research that looks at multi-bank holding companies, and as their affiliates are further away from them, it becomes more and more difficult for the headquarters to control the efficiency and the performance of their affiliates. Again, the idea here is that the further away you are, the more that gets lost as information has to travel over those long distances. Now, why Yen's paper is actually an improvement on the previous research is the previous research took distances given, and we know that it's not purely exogenous. Yen's has this nice shock, this nice exogenous shock, this natural experiment in which distance changes without being planned or affected by other things. They find that the affected banks, the banks that are now further away from their supervisors, they invested more of their assets in loans. The volatility of their earnings went up. The probability of failure went up, and they began under-provisioning for loan losses. Okay, so clearly, the result very consistent with the first paper. I have two conclusions, again, for this paper. Again, I'm going to repeat myself, did returns increase at the affected banks? And I think this paper might be a nice place to be able to test it because we're looking at office closures over a couple of decades, so we're going to get a lot of different business cycle conditions. The second is a question, maybe an extension, maybe something just to think about. What's the optimal number of supervisory offices? What's the optimal distance between a local supervisory office and the bank? Well, think about it briefly. In large systemically important banks, we must think that the optimal distance is 0 because we have examiners who report to the headquarters every day. We have examiners on site. Okay. Well, what about for tiny resolvable banks that are obviously not systemically important? If they fail, they're going to do so without causing any losses to the taxpayer or any systemic effects. What's the distance there? I could write down a mathematical model that shows the distance is infinite, that we don't even need to supervise those folks. Okay, but that's obviously reductio absurdum. I think that's really the underlying question here from policy and supervision. Right? How many of these offices do we have, or should we have? Well, that's a nice segue to Michelle's paper. And the underlying question there really is, should all banks be treated the same by bank supervisors? Now, in the U.S., we have one tradition here. We exempt smaller banks from certain regulatory measures. We impose more stringent regulatory measures on banks that are above $1 billion, above $10 billion, above $50 billion. I gave a talk to the Italian Bankers Association a couple years ago, and it was a one-day conference on exactly this point, we're small Italian banks. We don't want to be supervised the same way the large European banks are going to be supervised. But what can we do about it? So I was brought in, some people brought in to talk about how U.S. regulators make different rules for different sized banks. So this is a nice thing to take a look at. So what supervisory activity do the authors look at here? They look at whether and how loan loss accounting rules are enforced across banks of different sizes. And they have very clean results. They find the correlation of initial provisions for loan losses and later charge-offs decreases as banks get smaller. In other words, small banks aren't following the rules. So I have 3 questions here, and they're really extensions because this paper's earlier than the others. And there's different ways to go. I'm going to make 3 suggestions here. And we heard it once already. Is a small bank misprovisioning for loan losses? Is it random? Is it skewed above? Too much provisioning, too little provisioning? Or as some of us would expect, is it always under provisioning? This is something important for us to see. Second of all, can you distinguish why the small banks are provisioning differently than the larger banks? Are they just less capable or less skilled to do it correctly? Or are they just taking the freedom that the supervisor is giving them to take? That would be supervisory discretion as opposed to a lack of ability to do it correctly. And then finally, we know that the loan portfolios of very small banks are filled with very small business loans, which are very difficult to value and, of course, very difficult to predict. So it may be the case that their loan portfolio just naturally would be more difficult to provision for. And maybe there's nothing strategic or discretionary about this at all. So those are my comments. Remember, if you have questions, make sure you write them down. It's our pleasure, our great pleasure, to have Marty Birmingham here to finish up the formal part of this session. Marty is the president and the CEO of Five Star Bank in Rochester, New York, and like I said, we're looking forward to what he has to say. So, Marty.
Thank you very much.